A sodden Thursday morning in late October had turned the ground around the smokehouse into a slick, grey porridge of mud and wood ash. Rain drummed against the corrugated tin roof in a steady, relentless cadence, driving the chill straight through the drafty pine walls and filling the small office with the thick, heavy scent of cured hickory, damp wool, and old parchment. Wade Sterling sat motionless behind a broad pine desk that was currently smothered in 3 months of unfiled receipts, torn freight manifests, and salt-pitting vouchers. He was 50 years old, broad in the shoulders, with hair the colour of winter frost, and a heart that had grown quiet and heavy since his wife passed 2 springs ago. Grief had not made him bitter, but it had made him slow in the office. He could still cure a side of pork better than any man in the territory, but when he sat down before the inkwell, the numbers blurred into a grey fog of memory and regret. He was staring at an unpaid invoice from the regional rail spur when the heavy oak door creaked open. Catherine Boyd stepped into the room without knocking, bringing with her the sharp, cold scent of the autumn rain and the faint, distinct tang of mineral salt. She was 28 years old, tall, and straight-backed, carrying herself with the posture of a woman who had spent her entire youth managing a mercantile and her adulthood running an inherited salt works. She wore a heavy navy wool cloak, darkened at the shoulders by the weather, and carried a covered wicker basket in the crook of her elbow. She did not wait to be greeted. She did not offer a gentle smile or make small talk about the mud on the road. She closed the door behind her with a firm, deliberate push of her boot heel, unclasped her cloak, and hung it on the wooden peg near the stove with the automatic, unhurried efficiency of someone who had occupied working spaces her entire life. Wade looked up from his desk, his broad, calloused hands resting flat on the ruined scatter of his papers. He felt the sudden, quiet weight of her presence in the small room. "If you are looking for bacon, Miss Boyd," Wade said, his voice deep and gravelly from years of breathing with smoke, "I am afraid the ledger says I am either dead broke or missing 6 whole barrels of side belly." Catherine walked over to the desk. She set the wicker basket down on the edge of the timber, pulling back the oiled cloth to reveal 2 thick chubs of aged summer sausage, dark red and bound neatly in clean twine. "Your belly is hanging in curing shed 3, Mr. Sterling," Catherine said, her voice clear and level, carrying no more emotion than a grain tally sheet. "I walked past the open shutter on my way in. It is not the meat that is rotten in this establishment. It is your bookkeeping." Wade let out a slow exhale through his nose, a half-breath that might have been a laugh if there had been any humour left in the day. He shifted his broad shoulders, looking down at the ink-stained disaster between them. "The clerk left in July," Wade said simply. He did not offer an excuse. He merely stated the subtraction. Catherine did not offer condolences. She stripped off her heavy leather riding gloves, folding them once and placing them neatly beside the basket of sausage. From her mantle bag, she pulled a brass-bound boxwood ruler, a bottle of black iron gall ink, and her own thick, oilcloth-bound ledger. She pulled the straight-backed wooden chair opposite him, sat down, and smoothed the front of her dark wool skirt with the flat of her palms. She looked across the desk, her grey eyes sharp, steady, and entirely unbothered by the heavy, silent presence of the man sitting before her. Most men in the county looked at Catherine Boyd and saw a woman whose financial independence was an unspoken insult to their pride. They saw a woman who owned her own salt pans, who drove her own supply wagons, and who had reached her late 20s without yielding her name or her property to a husband. Wade Sterling looked at her and saw only an absolute, unyielding competence. "Your bacon is the best in the territory, Mr. Sterling," Catherine said, holding his gaze across the cluttered pine. "But your administrative arithmetic is a disaster. Let me fix it." Wade did not reach to cover his papers. He did not pull back out of pride or embarrassment. He was a practical man, and he knew when an equation was unbalanced. He looked at her straight spine, at the calm, capable set of her jaw, and he recognized the rare, quiet dignity of a person who took satisfaction in order. "I cannot pay you for clerical work, Miss Boyd," Wade said quietly. "Not until I know where those freight vouchers went." "You will pay me in a fair trade," she replied smoothly. 3 sides of smoked ham for every month of accounts I reconcile. And a fair contract for my coarse-ground rock salt when the spring curing starts." Wade looked down at the ruined stacks of parchment, then back up at Catherine. He gave a single, firm nod. The agreement was made without a handshake, without a written contract, bound only by the mutual understanding of 2 people who respected the precise value of labor. What Catherine did next was not done with grand flourishes or dramatic haste. She moved with the specific, rhythmic economy of a master craftsman approaching a workbench. She cleared a space on the right side of the desk, moving Wade's heavy cast-iron paperweight to establish an anchor point. She did not reach, she placed. She did not look away to ponder, she calculated. Every movement was a line drawn straight in a world that had gone crooked. She took the top layer of scattered receipts, flattening the wrinkled paper against the desk with the side of her hand. She sorted them by date, then by vendor, creating 3 distinct, immaculate stacks. When an invoice was missing its corresponding bill of lading, she set it aside in a 4th pile, marking the edge with a light stroke of a pencil. Wade stayed in his chair, watching her. He was a stoic man, accustomed to long hours of solitary labor in the smokehouses, but watching Catherine work was like watching a natural law take effect. There was no hesitation in her hands. When she reached for the inkwell, her arm moved with the exact clearance needed to avoid the corner of the ledger. When she dipped her steel nib, she tapped the excess against the glass rim twice, never 3 times, never once, but twice, maintaining a steady, productive rhythm that filled the small, cold office with the comforting scrape of metal on paper. At one point, as she reached across the desk to pull a cluster of damp receipts from near his left elbow, her wrist brushed against his calloused forearm. Neither of them flinched. Neither of them pulled away with polite, nervous apologies. Catherine simply gathered the papers, her eyes fixed on the dates written in faint pencil, while Wade remained perfectly still, holding his breath just enough so as to not disturb her balance. For 10 long seconds, as she leaned back to record a figure in her masterbook, her eyes caught his. There was no softness in the look, no romantic invitation, but there was an immense, unspoken weight. It was a silent evaluation. She was measuring his willingness to let her work without interference. He was measuring her quiet strength against the tide of chaos that had filled his life for 2 years. They held the gaze in absolute silence, the sound of the rain filling the space between them, until Catherine nodded once to herself, satisfied with the arithmetic of the man, and returned her pen to the page. By 11 o'clock, the storm outside had settled into a steady, cold drizzle. The air in the office had grown chilly as the small iron stove burned down to embers. Wade got up without a word, stepping heavy and quiet across the floorboards. He stoked the fire, adding 2 seasoned splits of hickory, and set a small tin pot of black coffee on the flat top to heat. He did not ask her how she took it. He had observed her at the general store 2 weeks prior, noted that she took her tin cup plain, without sugar or milk, drinking it down with the same practical indifference she applied to the weather. When the pot began to steam, he poured 2 heavy stoneware mugs, walked back to the desk, and set one near her right hand, placing it precisely on a clear patch of wood where it would not risk a single drop falling on her clean ledger pages. Catherine did not look up from her writing immediately. She finished the entry, blotted the wet ink with a piece of felt, and then reached for the mug. "Thank you," she said, her fingers wrapping around the warm clay. "You have cleared 2 months in 2 hours," Wade observed, leaning his broad frame against the edge of the desk, his arms crossed over his chest. "My former clerk took 3 days to do half that work, and he charged me $5 a week for the privilege." "Your former clerk did not understand that an unfiled receipt is a leak in the barrel," Catherine said, taking a slow sip of the black coffee. "You can smoke the finest pork in the territory, Mr. Sterling, but if you allow 5% of your profit to drain through the floorboards because you do not track your freight charges, you are laboring for the railroad, not for yourself." Wade looked down at her. He counted his years in his head, as he often did when he felt the dull ache in his lower back after a day of hauling salt barrels. He was 50. She was 28. The math of their ages was a heavy, immovable fact, a gap of 22 years that society measured as a vast, unbridgeable distance. He knew what the gossips in town said about her, how they called her cold and unnatural because she preferred the precision of her salt works to the submissive quiet of a traditional parlor. He knew what they said about him, too, that he was an old widower slowly sinking into the mud of his own farm, too set in his ways to save himself. Sitting here now, listening to the rain and the steady scratch of a pen, Wade realized that the town had calculated the equations all wrong. They saw a gap in years. He saw an alignment of values. They saw an arrogant woman. He saw a person who refused to let the world waste her time or her talent. By noon, the routine was firmly established. They had built a working rhythm without a single grand declaration or soft word. Catherine worked her way through the final stack of paper, her posture as straight and unyielding as it had been when she walked through the door 4 hours ago. Wade stayed beside her, answering her brief, targeted questions with exact numbers. He knew the weight of every hog slaughtered in August. She knew the exact rail freight per hundredweight down to the fraction of a penny. They were 2 practical people doing practical work, Yet something in the drafty, smoke-scented room had fundamentally shifted. The quiet disorder that had hung over Wade's life since his wife's death was being systematically dismantled, not with sympathy or tearful comfort, but with black ink, crisp paper, and absolute competence. When Catherine finally closed her oilcloth ledger with a soft, solid thud, the desktop before them was completely transformed. Where there had been a chaotic mountain of forgotten debt and lost records, there were now 4 neat, bound stacks of paper, aligned perfectly with the edge of the pine table. "Your accounts are balanced through September, Mr. Sterling," Catherine said, standing up and smoothing her skirt. "You owe the rail spur $14.12. The mining camp at Blackwood owes you $46 for hickory bacon delivered 3 weeks ago. You are not broke. You are merely owed what is yours." She picked up her leather gloves and began pulling them over her long fingers, her movements deliberate and precise. Wade stood up slowly, looking down at the pristine desk, then up into her face. He felt a quiet warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the hickory stove. "I will deliver your 3 hams on Monday morning, Miss Boyd," Wade said, his voice quiet and steadfast. "And I will bring the contract for the spring salt trade." Catherine paused, her gloved fingers resting on the handle of her wicker basket. She held his gaze across the small room, her grey eyes steady and clear. For a long moment, the only sound was the slow drip of rain from the eaves outside. "Make it 800 pounds of coarse rock salt, Mr. Sterling," she said quietly. "The math works better that way for both of us." "I will have the wagon loaded by 7, Wade replied. Catherine nodded once, a gesture of absolute finality. She draped her heavy navy cloak over her shoulders, clasped it at the neck without looking down, and walked to the door. She opened it, stepping out into the cold, damp air of the late October afternoon, leaving the door to close firmly behind her. Wade stood by his desk for a long time after she left. He looked down at the neat stacks of paper, then out the narrow glass window to watch her dark wagon pull away down the muddy road. The calculation was simple, grounded in the hard realities of the frontier, but as he sat back down in his chair and picked up his pen, Wade Sterling knew that the variables of his quiet life had changed for good. By the second week of November, the routine had taken hold with the quiet predictability of a clockwork mechanism. Every Tuesday and Friday morning, Catherine's light wooden buckboard would turn off the main territorial road and rattle up the cinder drive to the smokehouse. She would step down, her heavy leather boots making a firm, single strike against the gravel, carrying her oilcloth ledger under her arm. Wade would already have the tin coffee pot setting on the edge of the iron stove and a clean workspace cleared on the double pine desk. They worked without unnecessary speech. There was a deep, unhurried comfort in the shared labor, punctuated only by the rhythmic scrape of her pen nib, the heavy thud of quarter carcasses being hung on timber joists in the curing rooms, and the occasional dry exchange of numbers. The rest of the county, however, did not view their arrangement through the calm lens of administrative balance. In a frontier town built on rigid expectations, a 28-year-old unmarried woman who operated her own mineral works was already an uncomfortable variable. That she now spent long, unchaperoned hours in the smokehouse office of a 50-year-old widower was more than the local gossips could tolerate. At the general store and the flour mill, whispers began to circulate like dry leaves in an autumn wind. They said Catherine Boyd was using her uncle's salt money to corner a lonely man in his grief. They said Wade Sterling was letting a headstrong girl dictate his business because he was too tired to hold his own reins. Neither Wade nor Catherine addressed the chatter directly, but both evaluated its potential cost with their usual pragmatic exactness. Catherine knew that public opinion in a small territory could eventually leak into business relationships, threatening her distribution contracts with the regional mercantile supply houses. Wade knew that a woman's reputation on the frontier was fragile cargo, easily damaged by narrow-minded men with nothing better to calculate than their neighbor's business. The friction became concrete on a cold, overcast Wednesday when a black-lacquered buggy pulled up outside the smokehouse. Out stepped Silas Vance, the field agent for the regional meat syndicate. Vance was a soft-handed man in an expensive wool overcoat, whose skin had the dull, greyish cast of someone who spent his life in city offices buying up distressed assets for pennies on the dollar. He entered the smokehouse office without wiping his boots, bringing with him the sharp, artificial smell of cheap bay rum and cigar smoke. Vance did not glance at Catherine, who sat at the side desk auditing a ledger of brine weights, though his eyes lingered dismissively on her iron-bound tally boxes. He addressed Wade directly, leaning his hands on the timber counter with the patronizing ease of a man who believed he held every high card in the deck. "Mr. Sterling," Vance began, his voice smooth and oiled like leather dressing. The syndicate is consolidating the pork trade across the Eastern District. We are offering you $300 for your land, your curing sheds, and your goodwill. It is a generous sum for an operation that is clearly struggling to keep its books straight. Wade did not stand up. He remained seated behind his desk, his broad shoulder squared, his calloused hands resting heavy and immobile on the pine top. He looked at Vance with a steady, unblinking gaze that held neither anger nor fear, only an absolute, impenetrable stoicism. "My business is not for sale, Mr. Vance," Wade said, his gravelly voice dropping an octave into absolute certainty. "My accounts are balanced, and my pork is spoken for." Vance smiled, a thin, paper-dry movement of his lips that did not reach his pale eyes. He tapped a manicured finger against the desk. "You might find those accounts harder to balance come winter, Sterling. The syndicate has just secured exclusive commercial rights to every major salt pan and rail depot between here and the river. If you want white salt to cure your bellies, you will buy it from us at our price, or you will watch your meat spoil on the hooks. An independent smokehouse cannot survive without salt, Mr. Sterling. The math simply does not work in your favor." Vance turned his gaze toward Catherine for the first time, offering a thin, condescending tilt of his head. "And as for local suppliers," he added, his tone dripping with subtle poison, "we are currently reviewing the mineral safety standards of small, uncertified operations in the valley. It would be a pity if certain local merchants found their access to regional shipping lines cut off due to administrative irregularities." He turned on his heel and walked out, the heavy oak door slamming behind him. The silence in the office after his departure was absolute, broken only by the crackle of hickory in the stove. Wade did not move for a long minute. He sat looking at the closed door, calculating the threat. The syndicate was big, well capitalized, and ruthless. Cutting off commercial salt supplies was a standard tactic used to strangle independent processors until they were forced to sell at a loss. Catherine set her pen down in the groove of her desk. She did not express distress or panic. Her posture remained perfectly erect, her face a calm, unreadable canvas of quiet focus. She looked at Wade across the room, holding his gaze with a steady intensity that cut straight through the cold atmosphere Vance had left behind. "He thinks in terms of rail lines and commercial bulk freight," Catherine said, her voice dry and precise. "He does not understand local geology, and he does not understand how rock salt behaves in a brine tank." Wade leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "What are you calculating, Catherine?" "My uncle's salt works does not rely on the river rail spur," she said, pulling a fresh map of the county trade routes from her mantle bag and spreading it flat across the pine. "The salt pans in the upper valley produce a coarse-grained mineral rock salt that commercial packers dislike because it takes longer to dissolve. But for cold-process ham curing, it is superior to their bleached salt. It draws moisture faster and leaves no chemical bitterness in the fat." She pointed a long, clear finger at a dotted trail leading north into the mountains. "The silver and lead mining camps at Blackwood and Timberline have 600 men who need meat that will keep through a 4-month winter snow lock," Catherine continued. "The syndicate supplies them by rail at a 20% markup. If we process your pork using my coarse-grain rock salt, and haul the finished sides directly up the mountain wagon road before the high passes freeze, we bypass their rail monopoly entirely. We can sell directly to the mining commissaries at a 10% discount and still increase your net margin by 12%. Wade looked at the map, then up at her face. He saw no bravado in her grey eyes, no reckless anger against the syndicate, only the cool, brilliant execution of a superior strategy. She had turned a threat into a simple matter of logistics and mineral quality. "It will mean double the hauling labor for you," Wade said, his voice quiet with deep respect. "The mountain road in November is no easy drive. I have driven supply wagons since I was 16 years old, Mr. Sterling," Catherine replied without a trace of vanity. "The road does not care about gender. It only cares about draft horses and properly greased axles." The real test of their unspoken partnership came 3 days later, not from the syndicate's business moves, but from the town itself. Silas Vance, realizing that his economic threat had not intimidated them, resorted to a dirtier tactic. On Friday morning, the local weekly newspaper published a small, vicious item on the second page. Written anonymously but clearly funded by Vance, the notice questioned the purity of the salt produced at the Boyd Salt Works, hinting that the mineral beds were contaminated with clay and iron runoff. It went further, dropping unsavory hints about the propriety of a young woman who spent her days trading unrefined salt in private smokehouses with elderly widowers. When Wade walked into the general store to purchase grease and iron nails, he found 3 local farmers standing near the counter, reading the paper aloud and chuckling with cheap, judgmental amusement. The air in the store turned instantly cold as Wade stepped through the door. He was a large man, but usually quiet and slow to anger, moving through town with a soft, unassuming dignity. Today, his broad shoulders were set like granite, his jaw locked in a hard, dangerous line. He walked straight up to the counter, reached out with one massive, calloused hand, and snatched the newspaper out of the farmer's grip. He did not tear it. He folded it once, slowly and deliberately, his knuckles white against the dark newsprint. Wade looked at the 3 men. His grey eyes were as hard and grey as winter slate. "Catherine Boyd is the most honest merchant in this county," Wade said, his voice low, heavy, and vibrating with an authority that silenced the entire store. "Her salt is pure, her books are clean, and her word is worth more than every line of print in this rag. If any man here has something to say about her character or her business, he can say it to me right now across this counter." The store was dead quiet. The farmers looked at Wade's broad chest, at the deep, quiet fury in his eyes, and looked down at their boots. No one spoke. No one moved. Wade did not wait for a reply. He turned, walked out of the general store, and marched 3 blocks down Main Street directly to the printer's office. He kicked the door open, set the folded newspaper down on the editor's desk with a heavy thud, and demanded an immediate, printed retraction for the next issue, stating flatly that if another libelous word was printed about Miss Boyd, he would personally hold the paper accountable before the territorial magistrate. Word of Wade's march down Main Street reached Catherine by noon. She did not come to him with emotional gratitude or breathless thanks. She was not a woman given to dramatic displays. But when she arrived at the smokehouse that afternoon, carrying a crate of newly milled cedar bins, her posture held a quiet, subtle shift. Wade was in the side yard, greasing the heavy iron axles of his freight wagon in preparation for the mountain run. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing thick, muscular forearms stained with axle grease and wood ash. Catherine walked up to the wagon, setting her basket down on the running board. She looked at him for a long moment, her grey eyes softer than he had ever seen them, though her face remained composed. "You went to the printer," she said quietly. "I did," Wade replied, not pausing in his work as he applied grease to the iron spindle. A man who lets a good neighbour be lied about in public isn't fit to run a business. It was an act of defence that went far beyond mere neighbourliness, and both of them knew it. In a town that had treated her independence as a fault, Wade Sterling had stood up in his best coat and declared her competence and integrity to be absolute facts. He had not protected her because she was weak. He had protected her because he valued her truth. "I brought something for you," Catherine said, stepping closer to the wagon. She reached into her basket and pulled out a hand-drawn schematic rendered in crisp black ink. It was a layout for an integrated supply system, showing how her salt pans and his curing sheds could be connected by a shared storage barn built on the boundary line between their properties. "If we build this," she said, her finger tracing the clean lines of the drawing, "we cut our handling time in half. We eliminate the middleman freight charges entirely. We become a single operational unit." Wade stopped his grease paddle. He looked at the drawing, then looked up into her face. The rain had started again, a light, cold mist that clung to her dark hair and settled on the collar of her wool cloak. She did not flinch from the dampness, nor did she look away from his intense, steady gaze. "A single operational unit," Wade repeated slowly, his gravelly voice weighing the words. "That is a big commitment, Catherine. The town will talk even louder. Silas Vance will hit harder." "Let them talk," Catherine said, holding his gaze with complete, unwavering steadfastness. "Let them bring their worst calculations. The arithmetic of our work is sound, Wade. You and I build things that last." Wade set the grease paddle down on the workbench. He wiped his hands on a clean rag, stepped close to her, and looked down into her eyes. For the first time since they had met, he reached out and touched her, not with a romantic flourish, but with the practical, tender reverence of a man who recognized a priceless treasure. He placed his broad thumb gently against her cheek, wiping away a stray drop of cold rain. Catherine did not pull back. She rested her face slightly against his warm, callous palm, her breath catching just for a second before she regained her calm composure. They stood there in the quiet grey drizzle of the yard, surrounded by the smell of hickory smoke and raw cedar, bound together by a shared purpose that was rapidly transcending the boundaries of simple trade. Now, dear friends, isn't it something how an honest heart and a sharp mind can hold the line against those who think money buys everything? If you're rooting for Wade and Catherine to show that syndicate what true grit looks like, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment down below telling us where you're listening in from today. It truly helps our little porch Catherine grow, and we sure do appreciate every single one of you. By the end of November, the external pressure from Silas Vance had reached a boiling point. Realizing that his slander campaign had failed to deter them and that Wade was successfully shipping salted meats to the mining camps, Vance took a final, desperate gamble. He used the syndicate's political influence to block Wade and Catherine from securing space inside the main exhibition hall at the upcoming Territorial Agricultural Exposition in December. The Agricultural Exposition was the premier commercial event of the year, where government contractors, large hotel buyers, and mining representatives came to sign their annual supply agreements. Being excluded from the floor meant missing the chance to secure the long-term contracts needed to sustain their expanded operation through the coming year. When the official notice of exclusion arrived by courier, signed by the exposition board, Wade brought it directly to Catherine's desk. "They say there are no booth spaces remaining," Wade said, setting the paper down beside her inkwell. Vance had his friends on the committee mark us down as unverified independent contractors. Catherine read the notice once, her eyes scanning the formal bureaucratic language with cold, analytical speed. She did not look defeated. A faint, sharp smile touched the corners of her mouth, a look of pure, decisive intellect preparing for battle. "They gave us an answer," she said, leaning back in her chair and crossing her arms. "But they made a fatal error in their calculations." "What error?" Wade asked. "They excluded us from the interior exhibition floor," Catherine explained, pointing her pen at the small print at the bottom of the form. "But the rules of the Territorial Agricultural Society state that any registered landowner in the territory has the absolute right to display agricultural products on the exterior parade grounds, provided they supply their own shelter." She looked up at Wade, her grey eyes flashing with quiet brilliance. "The main hall is dark, crowded, and smells of wet oilcloth," Catherine said. "We will bring your heavy oak timber wagon and my polished cedar salt display right to the front gates of the exposition. We will set up our display in the open air, where every buyer entering the hall must pass us first. We will offer them fresh samples of hickory smoked ham cured with Pure Valley mineral salt, cut right before their eyes on a clean oak block." Wade looked at her, a low rumble of genuine laughter breaking from his chest for the first time in years. He saw the sheer, unyielding genius of her plan. They would not beg for a place at the syndicate's table. They would set up a better table right in front of the door. "We will need 200 pounds of prime hickory ham," Wade said, his eyes bright with shared purpose, "and 50 small linen bags of your custom salt rub." "I will have the bags sewn and labelled by Tuesday," Catherine said smoothly, picking up her pen once more. She dipped the steel nib into the black ink, tapped it twice against the glass rim, and began writing the supply list for the exposition. Wade stood beside her, his hand resting on the back of her chair, feeling the steady, quiet warmth of her presence. The external threats of the town, the syndicate, and Silas Vance had failed to tear them apart. Instead, like heat and smoke acting upon a fine side of pork, the friction had only cured their partnership into something indestructible, setting the stage for a final reckoning that would prove to the entire territory what true competence and devotion could accomplish. The morning of the Territorial Agricultural Exposition dawned clear, crisp, and bitter cold, casting a pale, golden frost over the county fairgrounds. By 6 a.m, the main hall was a hive of frantic activity, filled with representatives hanging banners and arranging displays under the dim oil lamps. Outside, standing squarely in the center of the main pedestrian thoroughfare leading to the hall's heavy double doors, sat Wade Sterling's broad freight wagon. It was a magnificent sight, constructed from scrubbed white oak and polished until the wood grain gleamed in the early sun. On the bed of the wagon, Wade had mounted 2 heavy cedar display cases with glass fronts, revealing whole hickory smoke hams hanging from hand-forged iron hooks, their dark, mahogany crusts glistening under the light. Beside them stood Catherine Boyd's mineral display, 6 small, immaculate brass-bound tubs filled with mountain rock salt, ranging from fine snow-white table crystals to coarse, pink-hued curing grains mixed with wild herbs. Wade stood on the wagon bed wearing his best navy wool coat, a white linen shirt, and a dark necktie, his broad shoulders squared against the morning wind. Beside him, Catherine wore a sharply tailored navy wool suit with white bone buttons, her long, dark hair swept back into a neat, firm coil at the nape of her neck. She held a brass-bound ledger under one arm and a razor-sharp carving knife in her gloved right hand. They did not shout or wave flags. They simply stood side by side in quiet, formidable dignity, letting the sheer quality of their work draw the eye. By 9 o'clock, the main gates opened, and a steady stream of hotel buyers, mining camp commissaries, and territorial merchants poured onto the grounds. They did not pass Wade's wagon. They were stopped cold by it. The rich, mouth-watering aroma of hickory smoke and savory spices filled the cold air, drawing the crowd like a magnet before anyone could even reach the main hall doors. With quiet, rhythmic precision, Catherine sliced paper-thin ribbons of cured ham, laying them on clean wooden boards for prospective buyers to sample. Wade answered questions in his deep, gravelly voice, explaining the exact temperature of the hickory smoke and the precise mineral balance of the mountain rock salt used in the cure. Within 2 hours, the crowd around their wagon was 3 people deep, while the interior hall behind them remained half empty. Silas Vance emerged from the main hall at 10 o'clock, his grey face twisted into a scowl as he saw his primary buyers gathered around the independent wagon. He marched through the crowd, flanked by 2 regional exposition inspectors, his soft hands clenching his velvet coat lapels. "This display is an illegal obstruction," Vance declared loudly, his voice echoing across the frost-covered gravel. "You were denied space on the exhibition floor, Sterling. You are operating without a valid territorial mineral certificate, and I demand these inspectors impound this wagon immediately." The crowd quieted, turning to watch the confrontation. Wade stepped down from the wagon bed, his massive frame looming over the city agent. He did not raise his voice. He did not raise a fist. He simply stood like a stone pillar, his eyes cold and calm. The rules of this society allow any registered landowner to display on the parade grounds, Mr. Vance, Wade said, his gravelly tone carrying clearly to every merchant present. "And as for our certificate, you had better ask Miss Boyd." Catherine stepped to the edge of the wagon, pulling a thick, ribbon-bound document from her ledger. She looked down at Vance with a cool, sharp intellect that cut through his bluster like a winter frost. "This is an official report from the Territorial School of Mines, dated 3 weeks ago," Catherine said, her voice ringing out crisp and level. "It contains an independent chemical audit of my mineral pans. It proves that the salt supplied by the regional syndicate contains 12% clay residue and moisture bloat, which rusts tin packaging and causes deep rot in meat barrels. My mineral salt yields 99.8% pure sodium chloride, drawing moisture 30% faster than your commercial product." She turned the document so the exposition judges and surrounding buyers could see the official golden seal stamped at the bottom. "Furthermore," Catherine continued, her eyes holding Vance in a vice grip of pure logic, "I have already filed an injunction with the territorial magistrate regarding the syndicate's libelous print notices. If you touch one wheel of this wagon, Mr. Vance, I will serve you with a restraint order that will freeze your regional supply accounts until the spring court term." The crowd erupted into murmurs of approval. The chief exposition inspector looked at the official seal on Catherine's document, then at the superior quality of the cured hams on the wagon, and turned to Vance with a frown. "The document is in order, Mr. Vance," the inspector said flatly. "The wagon stays." Silas Vance stood flushed and silent, realizing he had been completely outmatched by a woman with a ledger and a man with a steady heart. He turned on his heel and disappeared into the crowd, his influence in the territory shattered by the cold, undeniable truth of documented facts. When the exposition concluded at sunset, Wade's hickory smoke hams had been awarded the blue ribbon for best cured meat in the territory, while Catherine's mineral rubs took highest honors in the commercial division. More importantly, they had signed 3 long-term supply contracts with the largest mining syndicates in the Western District, securing their business for years to come. As the crowds thinned and the evening sky turned a deep, bruised violet, Wade and Catherine packed their remaining salt tubs into the rear of the oak wagon. The air was cold and still, the sound of their heavy boots crunching softly on the frost. They had won, not through dramatic battles or political favors, but through sheer, unyielding competence and mutual trust. Wade finished tightening the rope canvas over the wagon bed. He wiped his hands on a clean cloth and walked over to where Catherine stood near the front wheel, adjusting the harness on the draft horses. She was looking out over the quiet fairgrounds, her face calm, her breath rising in faint white plumes in the twilight air. Wade reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a heavy silver pocket watch attached to a worn leather strap. It was his father's watch, a solid, reliable piece of railroad mechanics that kept perfect time down to the second. He did not present it as a piece of romantic jewelry. He held it out on his open, callous palm, offering it as a tool of precision and a symbol of permanent devotion. "I have been running the figures in my head all afternoon, Catherine," Wade said, his deep voice carrying a quiet, resonant warmth that filled the cold space between them. "A single man running a smokehouse operates at a loss of efficiency. A salt works operating separate from a curing shed bleeds profit margin in double handling. But you and me. The math works out to something permanent." Catherine looked down at the silver watch resting in his massive hand, then looked up into his broad, honest face. There was no pretense in his grey eyes, no demand for submissiveness, only a profound respect for who she was and what she was capable of doing. "I don't need a man to balance my accounts, Wade," she said softly, though a gentle, uncharacteristic smile touched her lips. "I know you don't," Wade replied, holding her gaze with steady, absolute devotion. "That is why you are the only person in this territory I want holding the ledger of my life. I am 50, Catherine. I have years behind me, but I have a steady heart and an honest home. I want you to share it with me, as my partner in all things." Catherine stepped closer to him, reaching out with her gloved hand to take the silver watch from his palm. Her fingers brushed against his, and she did not pull away. She wrapped her fingers around the cool metal, then closed her hand over his calloused knuckles. "The arithmetic is sound, Wade," Catherine said, her voice clear and filled with a quiet, powerful emotion that needed no flourish. "A life spent working beside you is the best calculation I will ever make." They did not hold a grand wedding in a packed church. 3 weeks later, on a quiet Saturday evening as the first heavy snow of December began to fall, they held a simple parlor ceremony in Wade's home. The justice of the peace read the vows before 2 witnesses, the general storekeeper and his wife, who had long since abandoned their gossiping ways in favor of profound respect for the couple. Catherine wore a simple, beautifully tailored navy wool suit, her posture straight and proud. Wade stood beside her in his best coat, his broad hand holding hers with a gentle, protective warmth. When the vows were spoken, there were no dramatic speeches or tearful outbursts. They exchanged a long, quiet look of absolute understanding, a silent promise between 2 mature, practical souls who had built a foundation on honesty and labor. The following Monday, a new wooden sign was hung above the main gate of the expanded facility, painted in clear, bold black lettering, Sterling and Boyd, cured meats and fine mineral salts. The transition was seamless. They moved into the renovated house on the ridge between the saltworks and the smokehouse. In the main office, Wade had built a double-wide oak desk, positioned so they sat side by side before the large glass window overlooking the valley. As the deep winter snow locked the territory in ice, the daily routine continued with a comforting, harmonious rhythm. Every morning, the stove would crackle with hickory wood, the tin pot would steam with dark coffee, and the quiet office would fill with the steady scrape of pen nibs and the turning of ledger pages. Wade handled the cure and the heavy timber work. Catherine managed the accounts, the mineral production, and the freight schedules. They did not speak unnecessary words, because they no longer needed to. Every shared glance across the pine desk was a testament to a love built not on fleeting passion, but on the enduring bedrocks of competence, respect, and quiet devotion. And so, Wade and Catherine proved that when 2 steady souls build a life on honesty, hard work, and mutual respect, there isn't a storm in the territory that can knock it down. Thank you for spending your valuable time with us today, my friends. May your home be warm, your accounts be balanced, and your heart be filled with peace. Don't forget to press that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so we can gather round the fire again real soon. Until next time, God bless you, and take good care.